off, I guess we can have some time to invite Dr. Daniel D. Lee to respond to Dr. Daniel Lee's earlier remarks.
Like I said, even at Fuller, I had to put the D in the middle because if you, at this moment, type in Daniel Lee at fuller.edu, some random student would get that email. It would not be me. And then there's like Daniel Lee 1, Daniel Lee 2. Yeah, anyways. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Just some general comments, I think. I tell people like this idea of wrestling with contextuality and Asian American, because I teach Asian American studies. And the reason I do that is because I want to understand how to articulate the gospel. That's what I care about in the end. I don't really care that, I mean, it's secondary, right? Because I think some people think that when they look at the Asian American Center, I think I am like, I have to tell every single point, I say, you know, I am not your mother. I am not your grandmother. I don't care what your language you speak. I don't care who you marry. I'm not trying to make you more Asian. I don't care. I don't even think God cares. I just don't think there is no command in the Bible that says thou shalt be more, you know, Korean or it doesn't. That's not what it is, right? So it's not so much of like, it is important the fact that we own who we are because we have to allow ourselves to be in God's presence. But it's not so much like how can you be more, for me, authentically Chinese, I mean Korean, because once again, that's very, very complicated. It doesn't really mean much. And there's no commandment from God that says I should be more. I mean, my mom used to say that, but she doesn't say it anymore because she realizes, oh, she's American too, right? So I think that's part of the issue. We are trying to understand ourselves so we can own it, so we can bring that into God's presence. And then it's inevitably going to change. Right? So I think it's really important to kind of stress that identity can be an idol. And often it is, and it's, when it becomes that way, it's very oppressive. Like when I was talking about the first generation trying to impose, you know, it's idolatrous. It's oppressive. It's fluid. Culture is fluid, right? Whatever we are, we need to figure out how do we stay close to God, engage with God? I think that's the first thing. You know, the contextualization, this other point is this. I think people always think that contextualization or contextual engagement is going to always try to make the gospel easier to understand, right? Like water it down so it's more palatable to your, I don't know, you know, Hong Kongers plate, you know, put some more soy sauce in there, whatever, right? Like, I think, and I always tell people, why do you think it'll be easier? Maybe contextualization more sharply critiques what our problem is. Right? Say, this is the problem. This is what sin looks like. Right? And so I think we think that it's going to be like a making it more easier to understand, but I think it might be a greater challenge for a greater transformation and conversion to happen. It can go both ways. Right? So I think it's really important to understand. The AAQ, so I didn't really think about it because I generally think about how the AAQ works, and I do use the AAQ in different version of it. In Canada, in Australia, and UK, I just did a group with UK, and I learned so much. And America, because they're all predominantly white nations where there's an Asian American or Asian Canadian or Asian Australian. So they're all similar in that way. So I never thought about what that would look like in Hong Kong. But since I've been here since Tuesday, I've been thinking about what does that mean, right? And Dr. Lee, like I really appreciate this, like in terms of like, so obviously there's a cultural heritage, British colonial legacy, right? And it's in your system. Like when you say, well, it's the rule. How do you not? There's some things you just take for granted. It's water. It's in it, and you're like, well, of course. The of course you have to articulate. Because when the mainland see it, it's not of course. They're like, why are you like this? As you know. They're like, why are you people like this? Right? Because you take it for granted, but they do not. They think it's odd. Right? And vice versa. I do want to stress this though. There is how Hong Kongers see ethnic racial diversity in terms of how you treat and think about Filipino and Indonesian domestic workers. Right? Like you know, in the US, right, the biggest racial dichotomy is the black and white dichotomy because we have a long history of like racism, right? And if you go to Canada, it's white and First Nation. If you go to Australia, it's white and Aborigines. If you go to UK, I think it's white and like you know, South Asian, like, you know, what they call them Asian. As you know, the Asian just means South Asian over there, right? But here, I think the tension ends up being domestic workers because it's the biggest minority. And the question is, do you see them? Right? Well, you only see them if you see yourself. If you're like, oh, I'm just a human being, then you won't be able to see them either. And the question is, I think it's important, the fact that you see them. And the church sees them. Like, what is the relationship with the churches with the Filipino domestic workers, or even the increasing, you know, Indonesian domestic workers? I did a little bit of homework, not much. But what does that mean? I think it's important, right? The homeland thing, I'll just very quickly say this. I tell people, so I visited Korea for the first time for 41 years, like this summer, or past summer. And people in Korea ask me, well, do you feel like you're home? And I say, no, because I'm from LA. LA is Asian America. The people just like me. And it's big. I mean, like St. Gabriel Valley or 606 where I'm from, that's Asian America. And it's big, right? It's bigger than most cities, right? So, like, it's multiple cities that are like that. So for me, that feels like home, right? And of course, Korea is a part of who I am. And so I think I didn't talk about this thing, but I really emphasize the idea of the fact that we have multiple identities. And all the identities are different, right? My Korean ethnic identity, my Asian American racial identity, you know, my reform identity, multiple, and they all matter. I think, so if you think of it that way, it makes it a lot more flexible. Instead of trying to figure out, well, who am I really? I mean, then you're stuck. And I'm trying to avoid that. Like, oh, you tell like a second generation, you know, Australian, Chinese, who are you really? Well, they're Australian. And they're Chinese, ethnically. And they're minority. They're multiple things, right? The question is, how do you articulate all these different things and make sure all of them are somehow united and reconciled to Christ? That's the bottom line.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I guess Dr. Lee's insights also spark thoughts on concepts such as contextuality, paradox, identity and culture, and also God's covenantal relationship with us. So let's take a moment to reflect on this. Specifically, how can we embrace the challenges and the opportunities of this concept of contextuality theology in our field of studies, and of course, in our church ministry?
This is an open question, correct?
Yeah, for the panel.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you, Dr. Daniel, for your excellent presentation. We have read the paper earlier also, so thank you so much. It is very rich and very inspiring. And so when I read good papers, I like to take it to the practical level. And so, so how we deal with this in relation to our theological education. I've been thinking maybe one way, and maybe we can learn on other ways. So we have the Christian theology, the white dominant one, and we are the majority word, the contextual theology, and we all know that. So how we can bring the Christian dominant theology into realizing that they are also contextual theology, and they are to dialogue with us, so we can learn from one another, from our cultures, from our different identities, and so the body of Christ become richer, and we can be more interrelated and united. And I think when we think about it this way, it brings us to be interconnected and more united. We are all one in Christ. And so I thought about one thing is to test theories from the dominant Christian theology and to test it in our context. This way, we can show also the gap, and this way, also we can prove that this is also contextual theology, that it works on the Western world, but this can't work in the Middle Eastern world, for example. And so, for example, my PhD, it was on theology of reconciliation, and my case studies were on church conflict. So I decided to take a theory which was established in the Western world, which is Miroslav Volf's Theology of Reconciliation, which is an amazing theory. And by the way, Miroslav was my supervisor also. So I tested his theory in the Middle Eastern context, and I found the gaps. It is as simple as that. This theory was established in an individualistic culture, but it can't be applied in a communal culture. So I show the gaps, but there are a lot of beautiful things that we can learn from his theory to our churches, Middle Eastern churches. But at the same time, I was able, by God's grace, also to inform his theory to be more applied to more context. And so this way, his theory, it's contextual theory. And the adjusted theory that I was able to deliver in my PhD, it's also contextual. And so I think this way, if we can work into our context, but dialogue with other contexts, it can be one way to counter this. I can say more things, but maybe I can leave time for others.
Thank you for welcoming us so warmly, and it's wonderful to be here. I've been now in Australia for about 13 years, and one of the urgent pressing needs in the Australian context is for finding a better way of having a conversation between those of us who have arrived in Australia in the past 200 years and those who have been there for probably around 65,000 years, the indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Typically the conversation has gone something like this. Well, here we are Christians, we are here to share our theology with you. It is a universal theology, and you have no right to question it, simply to accept it. Of course, the response more recently is now from our indigenous friends, well, our theology is contextual. It's ours, we own it, and you should just accept it. How can we have this kind of conversation? And my own doctoral work, which was not worth necessarily saying much about here, but in one aspect I drew upon the work of a British sociologist who was trying to describe the social conditions of modernity. And if we accept that contextuality, and one might even say culturality, as being social conditions, it allows us to move into a different space and to see contextuality, culturality as qualities, as social conditions that are not simply walls behind which we hide in order to avoid having these really painful, though necessary, conversations and dialogues. And in this extent, I do find the concept of Dr. Lee of contextuality having some similarity with my own preference for the term culturality, because it allows this kind of dialogue and conversation that's vital for a better understanding of ourselves and the others with whom we must do life together.
Thank you. I really appreciate one particular point. I could mention others, but just one point I want to mention is Dr. Lee's comment on the concept of covenant, the covenantal community. I really find it helpful as you address the issue of contextualization. I was thinking of Paul's words in the book of Ephesians in chapter 2 when Paul used some very strong words. He said, God, Jesus on the cross has destroyed, remove, or demolish the wall of hostility. That is that we are reconciled to God and we are reconciled to one another. That double reconciliation. And because we are first reconciled to God, as you address the topic just now, that God speaks to us individually in our own context. And because of that, we are reconciled to God. Therefore, we can be reconciled to one another. Without connection to God, it's hard for me to say, you're right, I'm wrong. I can't, my context is always the best. Without God, I mean, it's very ethnocentric. I mean, that's where racism comes from. It's very ethnocentric because I am always right. My way of looking at things is always right. But without that reconciliation to God, recognizing God redeems us all, we all need God's redemption. With that, I can see that we are on a journey. Really, we are on a journey together to let go of my own cultural bias or blindness. And yet, we're not there yet, but it's on a journey together. I would say to pursue, because of that covenantal community, I would use the word biblically guided culture rather than a biblical culture. Because biblical culture, you can say, oh, I need to live like the Jews 2,000 years ago. No. It's a biblically guided culture. It's to become more and more Christ-like because of what Christ has done on the cross. That's the way I could look at contextualization. Because contextualization, in a way, if you put too much emphasis on it, it can be another form of ethnocentrism, to be honest, because a truly biblical indigenous culture needs to be interconnected. It's not that, oh, just, I'm always right, this is the way. But it has to be interconnected. We are reconciled to God as God's community. That's how we respond. But I really appreciate the concept of covenant is so important in that talk. But other things too, but that one really encouraged me.
So for myself, as a church historian, actually my expertise is in monasticism, which seems totally irrelevant to today's discussion. However, in my personal experience, I do encounter some things in my life that are making me to think about my identity, especially when someone asks me about why are you interested in Western church history as a Chinese native, and go abroad to study Western church history, which seems irrelevant to your own identity and culture for 4 years. So the question make me feel really interested in Dr. Lee's lecture is that rather, or how can Christianity as a global community can really interact with each other to stand further than the racial identity without falling into a danger being fragmented into different kinds of Christianity, which actually is happening in the field of church history. As you may know, we now have regional church histories. And while we study our regional church history, we ignore the big picture of the so-called Western church history as our tradition. I think, personally, this is a real danger for my own field. I guess it also applies to the theology studies, although we can say that we believe in one God, the fundamental is our basic of doing theology, but we also can have a back Jesus, and how people interpret God's fundamental work or the salvation in their own culture can be really different and fragmented. Do you have any idea that what we are going forward in our theological imaginations?
So one of my students asked me, she's a white woman, she said, why did you assign Luther? Isn't he a white male European theologian? Aren't we going to read diverse stuff? And I said, did you think that we're not going to read any European theologian? I mean, I was like, what? I was so confused. And I said, we're not going to think of Luther as a universal theologian. That's the problem, right? I love Luther. He's my favorite theologian. But I read him as a German medieval theologian. So this is like, I talk about this in my book. Like, so, okay, so I get converted by Redeemer, Tim Keller. I'm like, I got to reform theology because reformed theology come from heaven, not like this corrupted Korean church. That's what I'm thinking, right? I go over to Princeton, and I'm like, I'm going to read, best reformed theology. And I'm reading theology. I'm reading Luther, and I love Luther. I'm like, oh, when you really read Luther at that point, you realize how German he is, how medieval. He's like, oh my gosh, he's really medieval German. And he loves Germany. He's trying to interact with Germany. So here's Luther doing theology with a medieval German context. I also love Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Here's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a modern German theologian doing theology for the modern German theology context, right? Here's Daniel Lee doing theology for the medieval German context. What? That doesn't make sense. I love them so much that I try to emulate them, but I realize I can't copy them. Like, if I wanted to be the best Luther student, I have to do my theology. Like, I have to take my context seriously, which was very disappointing, because I wanted to grow up to be a famous white theologian, but I realized it's impossible. You know what I'm saying? So I realize, now I read them, but I say, well, I am doing my journey, but I'm trying to interact with different people because they have wisdom for my purposes, not for their purposes, right? So I think that's what the idea is. You're just looking around trying to figure out, because I didn't grow up Reformed. I became Reformed, and I said, oh my gosh, this is so helpful for my struggle. So I think that's why it's slightly different. I don't have any particular commitments to try to be this way. I'm like, that is so helpful for my calling. So I'm trying to take these things. I think the problem comes when we are not taking our context seriously. And context seriously means you know what the idols are. It doesn't mean I'm baptizing that's not what we're doing. I am the most critical of Asian America because I know what our sins are, right? I'm not trying to say, let's be more Asian. This is like nonsense. That's not what it is. It's not kind of a idolatry of, our heritage. It's saying, I need this to transform. I need this to really be under the lordship of Christ, but it is not. And if I just copy somebody else's homework, I'm not going to do my homework. That's what the thing is, right? So I'm saying, own your context. Own your issue. I'll give you one example. A lot of Asian American, and I think a lot of Asian churches too, we need a lot more robust theology and practice of family. Because if you copy Western theology, it's just not there, right? Now, unless you're Catholic. Catholics have a really robust family theology, right? But, it's the context of discipleship, our view of our family and our parents determines how we view God. There's so much. But we are under-resourced because we have to develop. Now, you can actually draw insights from different people along with our culture, along with philosophical, psychological insight. But we're just grabbing everything we can to figure this out. But this is our task. Our task is not to copy somebody else. Our task is figure out, okay, great. Here's an early church. Here's Maximus. Here's Athanasius. You can draw from everybody, but it's not for his sake. It's for this sake. I think that's what the distinction is.
Thank you. I always like to use an analogy of egg tart of Hong Kong to illustrate what you just said. Because egg tart is a unique Hong Kong style dessert, which is originally come from Portugal, but they use another steaming method to do the egg, so that it's not from the bakery, it's from a steamer. So it's more smooth, and it now has a crusty, outer crusty thing. So it is Hong Kong unique egg tart dessert. I think all of us in CGST, most of my colleagues will agree that we love to see a theology contextual like this way, and it is by Hong Kong or Asia theologians. We hope to see that happen. So I believe it's time to open the floor for questions. Our helpers are standing, and if you wish to write the questions, you can take opportunity to the nooks, and they will pass the nooks to me. Or you can also come up and queue in front of the mic.
Hello. I am the questionable person in this seminary. Always I like to ask questions. First, I'm a Chinese, but I love kimchi and bibimbap. So I think ecumenical Christianity is possible. Anyway, two questions, okay? One is just a short one. In your collateral, you mentioned racialization. Can you just explain a little bit about what you mean by racialization, that word? Second question, I think in the Chinese church context, a lot of time, what happened is the Chinese church, many Chinese Christians will say, I just want to follow the Bible. So you talk about, God treat me seriously. Some Chinese Christian will say, I do not want to treat myself seriously. I just want to surrender myself and give, all my will surrender to God. But in actuality, a lot of times the Chinese value is interpreted through the biblical text. For example, tiger mom, okay, or tiger dad, okay. They will say, okay, the Bible says, submit to your parents. This is the biblical teaching. Look at sleep one more, whatever the proverb says, sleep one more and poverty will come like a thief or something like that. So they will, quote all those biblical texts to support a particular type of values. So my question here is, how can you, as a pastor, I'm also a pastor beside professor, as a pastor, how can you help Christians to be more cultural sensitive without threatening them, without saying that, oh, you're just teaching Chinese value? How do you gently make Christians more culturally sensitive? What's your experience? Okay, thank you.
Racialization basically means the fact that you get treated based on what you look like. This happens in the US because race is so racially conscious. So, like I'm Korean American, and, Dr. Wang over there is a Hong Konger, right? We both go to, Oklahoma, and we just saw Asian. You people. Like, you people? Like me, and we're not, no, you people. Right? And then whatever they saw on TV about Japanese, you people. Like, what? How does that work, right? Like, oh, so that's what happens in the US. And, if you visited, this happens. So the question is, what the heck is that? You say, well, they're mistaken. No, they're not mistaken. This is how the whole society works historically. Now, if you go to like cultural centers like LA or New York, people are not that crude, but implicitly it's still functioning. And it's toxic, and you can't avoid it. You have to deal with it. That's basically what I'm trying to say. You have to acknowledge it. Whatever you don't know can still hurt you. You have to know what it is and how that works. Sometimes it's racism, sometimes not. Maybe just a bad leader. Other times, you're a great leader, but there's no hope for you. You will never get promoted. So that's what I mean. I think that, and that's a real thing. If you go to like UK, it's there. Canada, oh, it's there too. Australia, it's there too, right? Predominantly white nations, I mean, it's here too, like with how some of the Europeans see you, like it's there. So I think the question is, you know, how do you recognize the fact that it's a force, right? So I'm giving you theory in this lecture, right? Obviously, I'm a pastor, so I'm like, when I preach, I don't talk about theory, I just preach, right? For example, I've been recently saying this, and so I'll share this with you. It's something like, this is very Asian American contextualization, but I'll never mention that, right? I'll just say, you know, it's really important. I was at a retreat, and one person said, because I was talking about, you know, imagine, I said, how often do you think you'll see God in heaven? Because like, you know, like maybe, like 2 hours a week, and the rest of the time you go hang out by your friends or whatever, right? Hang out with your family, but I said, no. In heaven, you will be in God's presence forever. Like, it's like you're locked in a room with God forever. Now imagine that God is like your father. And you're locked in a room with your father forever. That's heaven. There's one guy after, sorry, he's a pastor. I love my dad and all, but that'd be hell. And I said, wait a minute. You love your father and all. What does that mean? How are you using the word love? Oh, I love my mom, but she's crazy. I love my dad, but he drives me insane. I love God, but I don't really like God that much. It turns out sometimes, for people, liking God is harder than loving God. That's really weird. But biblically speaking, people like and love God. Like when the psalmist talks about, because Paul's like, if I had it my way, on my days when I don't have to worship, I'll still spend time with God. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes in our churches, because we think about in terms of obligation, filial piety, we're not trying to be confusion, but it doesn't matter. We do this with God. They love God, but I'm like, oh, that's not the kind of love that God wants. Like, you should like God too. And you know what? You know, because I actually like my kids. I mean, I have to love my kids. You know, I'm a parent, right? But I also like them too, right? And I tell people like, oh, you know, God likes you too. Because sometimes it's a hard concept. Now you're like, that's a bizarre idea. Love is so important than like. I'm like, I'm going to tell you right now how this works in people's lives. They know they have to worship, but do they really enjoy God's worship? Because the psalmists, they long for God's presence. So I'm saying your God isn't very good. You need a better God. And I'm saying the true God is so much better than the version of God you have. Now, what I just told you in the last 5 minutes, it's explicit contextualization. I have not mentioned anything Asian American. I don't have to, right? I'm trying to describe to you, we swim in this thing, and you're not close to God, and your God isn't very good. But the God of the Bible is far better. That's what I'm trying to say. That's how it works. I'm not mentioning anything about culture, but I've thought of everything. I said, oh, this is how it's getting corrupted. It doesn't work. People are not enjoying, there's no joy in Christian life. Something is terribly wrong, but they're disciplined. They are sacrificial. But you don't enjoy it? Wait a minute, something's wrong here. It doesn't work that way, right? Gordon, he talks about the fact that in the New Testament, joy was a characteristic feature of Christians. I see a lot of Christians, at least in Asian American churches, are very committed, sacrificial, and they're miserable. And they don't like God that much, even though they'll never say that. And I say that's a faulty problem. It's something's wrong with their faith. Now, I'm not going to tell them it's wrong. I'm trying to help them see the fact that, hey, I'm trying to help them understand God's better than who they think God is. That's what I'm trying to do, right? And that's what preaching, that's what we do every Sunday, right? I'm trying to help them understand God is not like your father. That would be hell. God is far better.
So the next question. Please introduce yourself
Sorry.
first before us. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe I just hold it. Would it be easier? Instead of wasting time. And my name is Grace, and I happen to be remotely connected with one of the first, and Yun Zhao, the presidents of the college here. So that's one of the reasons why my husband and I actually have come to this particular seminar. We're particularly interested in the theme of this 50th anniversary sort of celebration, looking beyond, over and beyond. Given that I'm a very proud Hong Kong Chinese person, and although I work in the UK and New Zealand for quite some time, and also have lots of relations in the US and Canada, and I know the problem they have with being Asian Americans, Asian Canadians, and Asian Australians, and so on. But I'm also very glad that, on the panel, there are a variety of speakers coming from different perspectives, because, and without being disrespectful to Americans, and I think only Americans would dream of calling themselves having an American theology tradition, and which I'm not quite so sure how that is distinctly different from other and the continental, European, and whatever sort of theology. The reason I mention that is because I think the graduate school here, as with other church and seminary schools in Hong Kong, we're facing a crossroad. 50 years ago, most of the theological teachers and the seminary teachers and so on, and most of them actually trained in America, and with very few and a very small percentage from the UK. And given the very free and frank discussion that Dr. Daniel D. Lee have talked about, being Asian American in the theology school there, I'm not so sure whether that particular sort of label being given by the predominant culture on the Asian American, I'm not so sure whether it is a reductionist training tradition than what you call an expansionist, inclusive, and relevant, that type of teaching for the modern, for the new generation of colonial type of situation in the world now. And given that, I rather regret that sometimes the churches in Hong Kong regard the opening up of Hong Kong to the Greater Bay Area, to mainland China, as being something of a threat, rather than being God's great big door and windows and opportunities open. With any, without very formal sort of type of statistics, I understand at the current moment, there are over 900, they're close to one Hong Kong Chinese type of billion, about 100 million Chinese Christian in the mainland China there. And within the context that globally, the number of self-proclaimed and the Christian are actually diminishing. But the field and the possibilities are great and open in mainland China. So I'd like to see how the different speakers would address this issue. How can we make the theological training more relevant to the modern world? Thank you.
I just want to clarify the fact that the word Asian American was created, so Oriental was what was given to us, and Asian America was created by Asian Americans. So it's something that, so it's like how 50 years ago, the African Americans created like black and they owned positivity, so they turned something that was negative and owned it, right, in that way. So, I mean, Asian American has problems, but it is something that it can be constructive as well. It's like everything else, it's like a pros and cons of it. So I don't think it should be considered purely negative in that sense.
So another question?
panels and everyone, good afternoon. So my name's Connie, and I'm actually fly from Taiwan with my classmates. We both are theology students. So we are very excited about the seminar. It was a very interesting point of view where you actually putting in a lot of problems into a theory. Just like I think, it's not just the contextual. It's like everybody that when you read a Bible, you have your own glasses, right? It's not just Asian America. I'm actually living in Seattle for 30 years, and I went back to study in Taiwan, talking about cultural shock and a point of view, and also what they focus on teaching. I was struggling. I was questioning, am I in the right school? After 1 year, contextual point of view really echo what I've been through. But my question is that, what is the end game here? What is your your armor? Where are you talking about this? What do you try to accomplish? Because, it's so easy to talk the differences than talking about what we had in common. So, when we want to talk about differences, how we, like you say, you use the different terms, consolidation. How do we consolidate with God? So what is your goal? So that's my question, and it would be nice to hear a few of the panel because, for example, I really enjoyed the confidence, point out this confidence. That was very, very, very intriguing, by the way. Please.
I'll give a very short comment about this thing. So, once again, my comment is not, my goal is never to be like, oh, how do I mean, it's always, the purpose is, this is how I describe it. The purpose is a deeper healing of our particular hurts, because hurts are very, very particular. Deeper transformation, right? Because sometimes sins are very particular. Maybe you are very obedient, but what if obedience is a sin? Yeah. Which is weird, but you all know what I'm talking about, where performance and obedience is a hindrance to God. Well, somebody not, but we know what that is. So how do you articulate something like that? So deeper healing, deeper transformation, and then deeper, owning of our gifts, because we have particular gifts that other people don't have. So I think the question is, how do we have all of ourselves and more deep, all of ourselves be transformed and used for God's kingdom? That's the bottom line. If we don't get there, then we failed. I mean, so this is not like, oh, how do we talk about, who cares about identity? Like, it's not, you can go to UCLA and study that. Because we're a seminary, we're like, okay, we're doing this to do this. If you don't get here, then we failed.
Thank you.
I just want to respond to that question. I want to use one word which actually is in your paper, in your books as well as in your presentation, is the word normative. I think that's another key word, and that is that what is taken as normative. My culture, my theology is the normative. All the rest you need to contextualize as if you are not the normal. I think that is where the problem is. And I want to quote one phrase that I really like Andrew Wall's, and many of you read Andrew Wall's research and his comments. He used a phrase, he says, in all the cultures, one necessitates the other. I like this phrase. One necessitates the others, meaning that all the cultures, we all need to be redeemed, and yet one helps others to understand the whole purpose of God. I think there was an earlier question about, contextualization. I want to respond by saying that the way I learn is that if I study a part of a scripture, sitting with an African brother or a Latin American sister or somebody from the Middle East together, I learn so much more because I never look at this that way. They look at it completely differently. I miss the point totally because I never live in that context. And I think we enrich one another. And I think Andrew Wall is saying that as well, that the ultimate goal is that as we talk about contextualization is that we all enrich others so that we understand God's purpose in a much fuller way. That's, in a way, to answer your question, is my goal. And it's still in a journey. It's not going to be easy, but we are on this journey together as Christ has broken down that wall. So that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more panels? Love to hear your...
Well, I think understanding our differences will help us approach sensitively and more, to understand more how we can get to know the other and how we can bring them into our space identity. And in my lecture tomorrow, I will be bringing 4 different cultures that speaks about peace building and how we can learn from each one to ourselves. So we learn, as I echo also what Dr. Patrick said. We do that because we want to learn from one another to enrich ourselves and other. Yeah.
Perhaps if I can move this in a slightly different direction, but it builds on much of what we've been hearing. We all know, of course, that the 2 commandments that Jesus leaves with the church, of course, are to love God and love neighbor. And of course, I know what that means. It means I love my parents, mostly. And of course, I love my partner, my wife, and now my children. So it's solved. I know how to live biblically. However, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The 4 Loves. So he says there are 4 loves. Oh, that's challenging. That's more. I'd never thought about those before. So if I apply those, then surely that's it. I'll read Lewis. He will help me. But C.S. Lewis, of course, struggles with his own contextuality. And one of the things I've discovered in moving to Australia and working with students from a wide range of different contexts and cultures and backgrounds is there's a whole lot more to learning different ways of expressing love. And that's core to what it means to be not only a disciple, but also to be part of a global community of disciples who are all saying, well, actually, we love differently. So we need to learn from one another what it means to be better able to appreciate the way that others love, with all of the ritual or ceremony or performativity that might go with that in some cultures, or the way in which might be associated with non-familial expressions in other cultures. These are things that I've still learning and finding better ways of understanding how others love God and how they love neighbor.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because I do a lot of mission trip. So recently I just went to North Thailand, and I went to Manchester, and I also just went to China, Chengdu. So this contextual really helped me to put into a perspective, and really, actually in the practical on the church. For example, when I was in Manchester, we were gathering about 60 pastors, helping up all those Hong Kongese immigrants to UK right now. And 60 pastors are actually come from all over the Europe and America to help those Hong Kongese to immigrant. Because, in the beginning, we tried to bring the gospel to people, and the church only had 30 people, right? And all of a sudden there's 50, right? Because the couple comes, and then the aunts, and then who comes, and the kids, and the grandparents. All of a sudden, the church become 50 people, 100 people, then become mega church people, 300. Because the contextual, because their expectation of church are very different in America, right? In America, I'm from Seattle, we are very individual. We sort of like put our sleeves on, and you try to do your own thing. But in Chinese, we asking for help. And the expectation of the help is immense, it's huge. And so we're talking about how to reteach the people in church to embrace this type of expectation, and how do we work along with the resources. And but that's really good point, because then on the teaching to the disciples or to the people in the church, you can give them this type of perspective and then work along in that line. and so everybody can become a happy family. So anyway, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So just a quick question about the notes. Anyone did a notes that you want to pass to the stage? Please do it so. If not, we can ask this gentleman to start.
Can I speak? Okay. My name is Ng Hong. I'd like the first speaker from the floor. I've been a friend of Chen Yu, the president of this college a long time ago, and also Soyan Pui, Soyan Gong, at the time when we were at Hong Kong University together, breakthrough and all the development that came after that. But since then, my wife and I have left Hong Kong for the UK, then New Zealand, back home to Hong Kong, and then to Beijing. And so I'm not quite so sure that I'm really in touch with Hong Kong as much as you do, even though I've been back here for the last 20 years at the City University of Hong Kong. I have two questions, respectfully. One goes back, and the other one goes forward. The question which I'd like to go back is, in light of what you have said, and also from our respondent, your writing, I just want to know, in what way has the recent developments in theology make any changes to some of the fundamental creeds of Christianity? For example, has it changed in any essential way the Apostles' Creed? First question. The second question is looking forward. And I think that none of us here would be able to ignore what the Trump second term is going to do. And I think I've read most of his 26 executive orders that he signed a couple of days ago, and I have deep worry and reflection about all of that. And that reminds me of what long time ago Edward Said has been saying in his classic work, Orientalism. And that's the idea of hegemonic narrative or hegemonic discourse, imposing a certain norm on what should be discussed and what should not be discussed, how we're going to approach and how we're not going to approach. And it seems to me like the speaker just before me, there seems to be, at least on the news, a lot of things coming through from America, which is essentially the same as what Edward Said has been saying, that the imposition, the construction, and the application of a hegemonic narrative, American in origins imposed on a lot of discussion about what theology is or should be in this part of the world, the Orient. And so the question looking forward is, how will all what you've been saying have anything to do to help, say, for example, places like Hong Kong or places like mainland China to respond in a way not antagonistically or oppositionally, but in a way that can somehow move forward with what I think is going to be a power wave of change from the Trump administration. Specifically, the question is that he has an enormous reaction against diversity, against heterogeneity, and he got some of his executive orders have a lot to do with anti-immigration. What is anti-immigration? To change from diversity back to a Puritan, uniform, mythical American culture. And his executive orders against changing from gender into sex, away from the cultural definition into what is essentially a biological essentialist or definition of the genders. And all this seems to me to be from a non-essentialist idea of identity, where there is no essence of it. It has to be situationally constructed, reconstructed, negotiated, and changed as the person defined and redefined, who am I? And so there's enormous force towards uniformity, towards essentialism. What is that to do with theology? And what has that to do with Christianity? And fundamentally, what has to do with the faith that we call Christianity? And here, as you speak, some time ago, I kept reminding myself of what I've learned from writings like John Stott, Basic Christianity, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, which seems to me to be a very lay type of sophisticated approach of making faith and Christianity in a way that's understandable, in certain way transcending culture, transcending context. And so when you talk about theological contextuality, would this pull our faith, our belief away from that, or in a way which is closer to what I believe to be the universal faith? Thank you.
This is an easy question. I have a very simple answer for this. No, this is okay. I'll give some room for other people to kind of respond as well. So the first question about recent development in changing fundamentals. I think the idea is the fact that even for example, like Nicene Creed, it comes out of a particular context. Now, are the insights they give, is it universal? I think so, and I believe so. But that's a particular question they're dealing with, and they address that question. Let me tell you a really weird question. The KKK in the US is a Christian organization, and they have no problem with the ecumenical creeds. They can say they're absolutely orthodox in terms of the creeds. Does the creeds work? It does not. Not for that question. So that's basically, so are they a Christian group? No, I mean, I think from my perspective, that's insane. But how does the creeds work? Well, they address a particular question at a particular time. And you would think it'd be universal. It is, but you realize there can be other serious problems that would actually invalidate faith altogether. So I think this is basically how we think about theological development. I'm like, what does that mean? How does that work, right? That's the struggle of theology. You would think it'd be just universal and you just let it sit there and it does its thing, but it just doesn't do that, right? And that's basically, I think, why it's more complicated. And how do we do that? I don't think it's a matter of like invalidating the fundamentals. I mean, I think it's a problem to kind of do that. But at the same time, it's like, well, how we articulate it in this way might not be the best way of thinking about it. That it actually might have a different kind of a problem. Like all the investment in apologetics. Investment in apologetics is actually investment in modernity. So when modernity became postmodern, everybody called postmodern demonic. But it's because we put all our chips in modernity. Is modern Christian? No, it's got its own set of problems. So I think that's basically what we're talking about. So we realize we invested in modernity as well, and now we're calling that demonic instead of realizing, oh, this investment is limiting, and it's got its own set of problems as well. So I think that's basically the question. With Trump, I mean, obviously it's a humongous problem. And there are a lot of questions. Oh, I wanted to comment on this thing. So I said generally U.S. society is individualistic, but you know, U.S. as a whole thing is not, obviously, right? Because U.S. is not all white. And that's the difference between Hollywood and media and the fact that demographics of U.S. is not what it is, right? Like LA is like predominantly Hispanic. So that's why when you go there, it doesn't feel the same way. And if you go to the Midwest, with a lot of people with German roots, they're very collective and communal, right? So you're like, well, so this kind of flat description of places don't really work. Is Europe individualistic? There's an NPR interview, like, you know, National Public interview, and I always tell this parable. Scotland was trying to separate from England, right, UK, and the Prime Minister of Scotland said, she said, on the radio interview, she said, well, we're not like those people in London. We don't care about money only. We care about family. I was thinking, wow, That is a shade, like, wow, that's like serious. But she was saying, we're not that individualistic like people in London. We're collective, right? As you know, like, Ireland is very different. I mean, so I think we have this, that's basically why I say this simplistic dichotomy doesn't really work. Italian countryside, totally collective, right? It doesn't work that way. Now, is there a modern individualism? Yes, there is. But there are layers and layers of different things, and the question is, okay, in that simplistic shortcut, you know, that simplistic way of talking, it's helpful, but we do need, like, when we're theorizing, we need another way of thinking about all the different layers of it. The Trump thing is a humongous problem. There's tons of Christians resisting. It's not like they're all getting along with this thing, right? So obviously there's tons of churches that are, you know, like, I try not to look at the social media because if I start looking at that, I really wouldn't be able to think about what's happening here. I was like, if I do this, I won't be present at the lecture, give the lecture even, right? It's a disaster, it's a crisis. And I think it's one of the worst PR, public relations. People are just leaving church. They're like, if this is what Christianity is, then we don't want any of it. So there are tons of people leaving church, especially younger people, right? I mean, so this is a serious problem. And the question is, how did this happen? You know, that's literally a whole other conference. It's so humongous, you know. So I'm not sharing here to talk about the greatness, oh, we have this amazing insights from America. That's not what I'm doing, right? So I think we're saying this is, as a minority in a white country, this is what we're dealing with, and maybe we can learn together. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much. So we are near the conclusion of this session. Maybe I can wrap up the whole session with a picture. Like our theological contextuality is like of fine wine. So it's best appreciated in its own proper context. Thank you so much for our two Dr. Daniel Lees, who gave us a really stimulating discussion, and also three of our guest speakers. They also contribute a lot into this Q&A section. Please join me to express our gratitude to them.